There were three technological developments in the late 19th century that made the modern submarine practical: the internal combustion engine, the lead-acid storage battery, and the self-propelled torpedo. Note that submarine can be a misleading term. Basically, all submarines before the German Type 21 were specialized surface ships with the ability to submerge. This is reflected by the underwater performance, which was usually inferior to the surface performance. The first modern commissioned US submarine was the USS Holland, named after her designer John Holland. He had different approaches than many contemporary designers. He favored diving planes instead of diving propellers, which pulled the ship down kinda like an inverse helicopter, whereas Holland's approach was more similar to an airplane. Another aspect was the different use of ballast tanks. Holland used an almost full tank, whereas the competitors used partially filled tanks. The problem with partially filled tanks is that water can shift easily and can interfere with the balance of the ship, thus endangering the whole submarine. As you can clearly see in this simple example, the second tank has a large portion of the water shifted to the right, whereas in the first tank the difference is significantly smaller. This was not a theoretical problem at all. Since submarines were quite small in those times, a change in weight, like firing a torpedo, could be enough to destabilize a submarine, as happened at a trial to a European inventor. The water rushed into the aft section of the submarine and pulled the stern down while the bow went up. Like many designers, John Holland had several less successful designs, probably most notable the plunger, which was never completed. Yet in that case it was mostly to the requirements given by the Navy. His next design, the Holland 6, was based on his own ideas. The Holland 6 saw her first trial in 1898. During which poor handling was observed. The test captain suggested to move the rudder and diving plane behind the propeller. Initially Holland was reluctant, but finally modified the submarine accordingly. Further modifications were the removal of the aft dynamite gun and additional trim tanks. After another 2 trials, the US Navy bought the Holland 6 and named her USS Holland. In terms of design, there were several aspects about the USS Holland that are very different from our common view on submarines. She didn't have a periscope because she was intended to reach the surface periodically while performing an upward and downward motion, in which the commander would look through the porthole of the conning tower. Furthermore, there were no subdivision in the ship. The argument was that the commander's view on the engines would be blocked. Yet it soon became obvious that gasoline fumes would circulate far too easily, and choking to death or dying from an explosion can be considered even more detrimental to the commander's vision. Let's take a look at the dimensions. The length of the USS Holland was about 16 meters. Her displacement was 63 tons surfaced and 74 tons submerged. As always, these values are a bit different depending on the source. The surface speed was 6 to 7 knots with a range of 1,500 nautical miles. Where submerged, she could travel with around 5 knots for 8 hours, thus having a range of 40 nautical miles. Now let's take a look at the internal structure. There was an auxiliary motor to drive the compressor, the gasoline engine, the main ballast tank, the conning tower, several trim tanks, the battery, the gasoline tank, the torpedo tube, and the dynamite gun. Now a dynamite gun is an artillery that fires an explosive charge instead of just a projectile. But due to the instability of early high explosive, it used compressed air to propel the charge instead of an exploding propellant. Because you want to blow up the enemy, not yourself. The USS Holland was an important ship, as she was the first commissioned submarine in the US Navy, and thus provided valuable data on day-to-day operations for extended periods, which is fundamental for military vehicles, because the performance of prototypes can be misleading to the inherent limits of testing scenarios and the design process. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, share and subscribe. And see you next time.